Watch a man closely when he makes a decision. Not what he decides, but what comes after. Does he act and move forward, or does he immediately begin explaining? Does he justify his choice to anyone who might question it? Does he preemptively defend himself against criticism that hasn't even been voiced yet? This tells you everything about his internal state. A strong man acts. A weak man acts and then explains. The difference is not in the action itself, but in what follows. The strong man's authority comes from within. The weak man's authority depends on external agreement, and in that dependence lies his weakness. Modern culture has created an environment where people feel compelled to explain everything. Every choice must be justified. Every action must be accompanied by reasoning that others can understand and approve. But this is not strength. This is the desperation of someone who has placed their internal authority in the hands of others and must now constantly petition for its return. If you recognize this pattern in yourself, if you feel the constant need to explain and justify your choices, then what follows will challenge you. This is not motivational content. This is examination. And if you're ready to confront this truth, the truth that your constant explaining reveals weakness, not wisdom, then subscribe now. Stay and listen carefully, because understanding this principle could transform how you move through the world. The Stoics understood something fundamental about human nature. They understood that the person who requires external validation for their choices has already surrendered their autonomy. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the opinions of others should not disturb the mind, not because those opinions are always wrong, but because basing your actions on the need for approval makes you a servant to every person whose opinion you seek. It makes you reactive rather than self-directed. It makes you weak because your strength becomes dependent on forces outside your control. Consider what happens when a person makes a choice and immediately begins explaining it. They reveal doubt. Not productive doubt, but the corrosive doubt that comes from lacking internal conviction. They reveal that they themselves are not fully convinced of their own decision, and they hope that by explaining it sufficiently, they can borrow conviction from others. But conviction cannot be borrowed. Authority cannot be granted by consensus. These things either exist within you or they do not. This is why powerful people do not explain themselves. Not because they are arrogant, but because their authority comes from internal conviction rather than external validation. When a person acts from genuine internal authority, when they have examined their principles, clarified their values, and made a decision aligned with both, there is nothing to explain. The action speaks for itself. Seneca wrote extensively about the importance of self-sufficiency in judgment. He observed that most people live as if their minds were constantly on trial, with the world as judge and jury. Every decision must be defended, every choice must be argued, but this is not living. This is performing. And the person who lives this way never develops genuine internal authority because they never practice trusting their own judgment without external reinforcement. The pattern begins early. A child makes a choice and is immediately asked to explain it. This teaches them that their actions are not legitimate until they can be justified to an external authority. And this lesson, internalized over years, creates adults who cannot act without immediately wondering how they will explain themselves. They lose the capacity to know their own mind because every thought is filtered through the question of how it will be received. Watch how this manifests in everyday interactions. A person states a preference and immediately begins explaining why, as if preferences require justification. A person makes a decision about their own life and feels compelled to justify it to people who have no stake in the outcome. A person sets a boundary and then undermines it by explaining at length why they need that boundary. essentially asking permission to protect themselves. In each case, the explanation reveals the same thing: a lack of internal authority, a belief that their choice is not legitimate until others agree it is reasonable. This is profound weakness. Not physical weakness, but the weakness that comes from having surrendered the sovereignty of your own mind. Epictetus taught his students that they should care about their own judgments, not the judgments of others about their judgments. This distinction is crucial. You should examine your own reasoning, question your own motivations, refine your own thinking, but this examination should be internal. When you make the examination external, when you need others to validate your reasoning before you can trust it, you have lost the capacity for genuine self-governance. This does not mean that the strong person never explains anything. Context matters. When teaching, explanation is necessary. When coordinating with others toward a shared goal, explanation facilitates cooperation. But these explanations come from a different place. They come from choice, not compulsion, from generosity, not desperation. The difference is palpable. When a person explains from strength, the explanation is clear, brief, and indifferent to whether it convinces. When a person explains from weakness, the explanation is lengthy, defensive, and desperate for agreement. Consider the psychological cost of constant explaining. Every decision becomes an event that requires preparation, performance, and follow-up justification. The mind cannot rest because it is constantly constructing defenses against anticipated criticism. The person becomes reactive, always responding to real or imagined judgment, never simply acting from their own center. This exhaustion is existential. The person never gets to experience their own authority. They never develop the strength that comes from trusting your own judgment even when others disagree. The modern person faces intensified pressure, not just from the people directly around them, but from the abstracted audience of social media, from the imagined judgment of strangers. And most handle this pressure by explaining constantly, by performing their reasoning for this vast, fragmented audience, by seeking validation from people who do not know them, will never be satisfied regardless of how thoroughly they explain themselves. In this environment, the person who can act without explaining stands out through simple self-possession. They make decisions and move forward. They do not perform justification for an audience. They do not make their internal peace dependent on external approval. And this restraint, this silence, it reads as strength because it is strength. Silence, in this context, is not avoidance. It is the silence of someone who has reasoning and conviction but does not need to perform them for validation. It is the silence that comes from internal authority, the silence that says, I have made my decision based on my principles and my judgment, and I do not require your approval to move forward. This kind of silence unsettles people. When they encounter someone who simply acts and offers no explanation, they do not know how to respond. What they are actually encountering is wholeness. They are encountering a person who has not fragmented their authority by distributing it to everyone who asks for justification. Seneca warned against the compulsion to always make oneself understood. He recognized that this compulsion makes a person vulnerable to manipulation. The moment you need to be understood, you have given others power over you. They can withhold understanding, they can refuse agreement, and in doing so, they can control your peace, your confidence, your sense of legitimacy. But the person who does not need to be understood cannot be controlled in this way. Consider how this plays out in relationships. A person sets a boundary and then spends 30 minutes explaining why they need that boundary. But a boundary that requires explanation and agreement is not a boundary. It is a request. A real boundary is stated and maintained regardless of whether the other person understands or approves. The person who constantly explains their boundaries is revealing that they do not fully believe they have the right to set boundaries. and this seeking undermines the boundary before it is even tested. The same pattern appears professionally. A person makes a decision within their area of responsibility and then feels compelled to explain that decision at length to people who have no authority over them. This constant explaining signals to others that the person lacks confidence in their own authority. It invites questioning, second-guessing, interference. Strong leaders do not constantly explain their decisions. They communicate what needs to be communicated, but they do not perform justification. They act from clear principles and trust their own judgment. This creates a different dynamic. People learn that the decision will stand regardless, that the leader's authority comes from within, not from consensus. This is not authoritarianism, this is self-possession. The authoritarian demands agreement through force. The self-possessed person does not demand agreement at all. They make their decision, accept that others may disagree, and move forward without needing to convert the disagreement into consensus. Breaking the pattern of constant explanation requires practice. It means catching yourself in the act of over-explaining and choosing silence instead. Not defensive silence, but the silence of someone who has examined their position internally and does not need external validation to trust it. This practice is uncomfortable at first. The urge to explain will be powerful. But if you can sit with this discomfort, if you can resist the compulsion to explain, something shifts. You begin to discover your own authority. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the mind should be like a fortress, impregnable to external attack. But this fortress cannot be built while constantly opening the gates to seek validation. It requires doing the internal work without audience, of making decisions without performance, of acting without explanation. The person who masters this becomes formidable through self-possession. They are not easily manipulated because they do not need your approval. They are not easily offended because they do not make your opinion the measure of their value. They have internal authority, and that authority makes them strong in a way that no amount of external validation can create. Watch how such people move through conflict. They state their position clearly and allow others to disagree. They do not make the disagreement a referendum on their worth. They are comfortable standing in their conviction even when standing alone. And this comfort, this lack of desperation for validation, often resolves conflict more effectively than any amount of explaining could, because silence from strength signals resolve. Seneca advised spending time in self-examination each day, not performance of self-examination for others, but genuine internal accounting. This practice builds internal authority because it trains you to use your own judgment as the final measure. And when you know your own mind, when you have done the internal work of clarifying principles and examining actions, you do not need to constantly explain yourself. This freedom is what strength actually means in the Stoic sense. Not freedom to do whatever you want without consequence, but the freedom that comes from self-governance, from having internal authority rather than depending on external validation, from being able to act according to your principles even when others misunderstand or disapprove or demand explanation. The weak person cannot access this freedom because they have made their internal state dependent on external forces. They need understanding, they need approval, they need agreement, and these needs make them controllable. The strong person has no such needs. They prefer understanding, but they do not need it. And this lack of need makes them free. This is the path the Stoics taught. Not the path to popularity or universal approval, but the path to internal authority, to genuine strength, to the kind of freedom that comes from self-governance rather than external permission. And the first step on this path is simple but profound. Stop explaining yourself. Not completely, not in every situation, but stop the compulsive explaining. Stop the performance of justification for people whose approval you do not need. Stop making your internal authority dependent on external agreement. Act from principle. Make decisions based on your best judgment after genuine internal examination, and then move forward. Let your actions speak. Let your character demonstrate itself over time. Some will misunderstand, some will judge, some will disapprove, and you will survive all of it. Because your authority does not come from them. Your conviction does not depend on their agreement. Your worth is not measured by their approval. You are not weak because you cannot explain yourself. You are weak because you feel you must. Reclaim that authority. Conduct your examinations internally. Trust your own judgment. Act on your principles. And let the silence of conviction replace the noise of desperate justification. This is strength. This is freedom. This is what it means to govern yourself rather than being governed by the opinions of others. The choice is yours. Make it, and then move forward. Without explanation, without justification, without the need for anyone's approval but your own.